In a small, quiet village surrounded by dense, whispering woods, life moved slowly. The air was always filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the mornings were often wrapped in a thin veil of mist that clung to the trees like a shy child hiding behind their parents' leg. This was where Maya lived, a young woman whose days were as predictable as the rising sun. At just 19 years old, she carried the weight of responsibility on her slender shoulders. Her grandmother, frail and sickly, depended on her entirely, and Maya worked tirelessly to provide for them both. Every morning, before the first rays of sunlight could peek through the cracks in her worn wooden shutters, Maya would rise. She'd tie her long dark hair into a loose braid, grab her woven basket, and set off into the forest. The villagers knew her well. She was the girl who sold bundles of herbs and firewood at the market every afternoon. Though her earnings were meager, they were enough to keep food on the table and medicine for her grandmother's ailments. Life wasn't easy, but Maya had learned to find beauty in the little things, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, the chirping of birds, and the earthy smell of moss underfoot. On this particular morning, however, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy Maya couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the storm that had rolled in the night before, leaving the ground soggy and the streams swollen. Or maybe it was the strange feeling she got as she ventured deeper into the forest than usual. Normally, she stuck to the familiar trails close to the village, but today, driven by desperation, her stock of herbs was nearly depleted. She decided to explore further. The deeper she went, the more the forest seemed to change. The towering trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead like fingers locking together to block out the sky. The sounds of the village faded into silence, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional drip of water from the still wet canopy above. Maya paused for a moment, listening. Something didn't feel right. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching her. But there was no one. Just the endless rows of trees standing like silent sentinels. Shaking off her unease, she pressed on. After all, she reminded herself, what was there to fear? She had walked these woods countless times before. What harm could come from straying a little farther today? It wasn't long before she found what she was looking for: clusters of wild mint and chamomile growing along the edge of a narrow stream. Kneeling down, she began carefully plucking the fragrant leaves and placing them in her basket. As she worked, her thoughts drifted to her grandmother. How much longer could she keep doing this? The older woman's condition was worsening, and Maya feared that no amount of herbs or remedies could hold back the inevitable forever. Still, she pushed those thoughts aside. Worrying wouldn't solve anything. For now, all she could do was focus on surviving each day. Just as she was about to stand up and move to another patch of plants, a flash of color caught her eye. It was unusual, not the greens and browns of the forest floor, but something brighter, almost unnatural. Curious, she followed it, stepping cautiously over roots and rocks until she reached the source. And then, her breath caught in her throat. There, sprawled motionless near the edge of the stream, was a man. His clothes were soaked and torn, his face pale and streaked with dirt. A glint of metal around his wrist caught the faint light. A watch, expensive-looking even in its current state. Blood stained the sleeve of his once pristine shirt, and his chest rose and fell shallowly, signaling that he was still alive, but barely. Maya froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who was he? What was he doing here? Her mind raced with questions, but one thing was certain: he needed help. Hesitation gripped her. The forest wasn't safe, especially not for strangers. There were rumors of bandits and poachers lurking in the shadows, preying on anyone foolish enough to wander too far from the village. Could this man be one of them? Or worse, could he be dangerous? But as she stood there, staring at his battered form, doubt crept in. He looked more pitiful than threatening. The expensive watch and tailored suit suggested he wasn't from around here. Perhaps he was a traveler who had taken a wrong turn and ended up lost in the wilderness. Either way, leaving him there to die felt wrong. No matter how scared she was, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. Taking a deep breath, Maya approached him slowly, her footsteps soft against the damp ground. She knelt beside him and gently touched his shoulder. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can you hear me?" There was no response. His eyes remained closed, his breathing labored. Knowing she had to act quickly, Maya scanned the area for any signs of danger. When she saw none, she made a decision. Dragging him to safety wouldn't be easy. He was much larger than her, and the uneven terrain made movement difficult. But she couldn't leave him here. Summoning all her strength, she managed to hoist one of his arms over her shoulders and began pulling him toward a nearby clearing. It took several grueling minutes, but eventually she reached a spot shielded by thick bushes. Here, she laid him down gently and examined his injuries. The wound on his arm looked serious, but it wasn't bleeding heavily anymore, which gave her some hope. Using the limited supplies in her basket, a strip of cloth and a few dried herbs, she cleaned and bandaged the injury as best she could. Then she gathered some water from the stream and trickled it onto his lips, hoping to revive him. As she worked, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was going to change everything. She didn't know who this man was or why fate had brought him crashing into her life, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were unlike anything Maya had ever experienced. Caring for the stranger became her sole focus, consuming every waking moment. She brought him back to her modest home, a tiny wooden hut nestled on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by wildflowers and shaded by towering trees. It wasn't much, but it was safe, and for now that was all that mattered. At first the man remained unconscious, his breathing shallow and uneven. Maya kept a constant vigil by his side, changing the makeshift bandages on his arm and ensuring he stayed hydrated. She used what little food she had to prepare simple broths, coaxing them into his mouth drop by drop whenever he showed signs of stirring. The effort left her exhausted, but there was something about the way he lay there, so vulnerable, so utterly dependent on her, that stirred a deep sense of purpose within her. For once, she wasn't just scraping by to survive. She was making a difference in someone's life. On the third day, his eyes fluttered open. Maya was kneeling beside him, adjusting the blanket draped over his body. When she noticed the faint movement, her heart skipped a beat. "You're awake," she said softly, leaning closer. His gaze was unfocused at first, darting around the room as if trying to piece together where he was. Slowly, his eyes settled on hers, and though his face was pale and drawn, a flicker of recognition passed through them. "Where am I?" he croaked, his voice hoarse from disuse. "In my home," Maya replied simply. "You were hurt in the forest. I found you." For a long moment he said nothing, his brow furrowing as if he were struggling to remember how he'd ended, up there. Then, with great effort, he pushed himself into a sitting position, wincing as pain shot through his injured arm. Maya quickly moved to support him, placing a hand on his shoulder to steady him. "Take it easy," she warned. "You've been through a lot." He nodded weakly, then glanced down at his bandaged arm. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice tinged with gratitude. "I don't know what happened, but thank you for saving me." Over the next few days, as his strength gradually returned, he began to share bits and pieces of his story. His name was Ethan Cross, he explained, and he was a businessman from the city. He had come to the forest seeking solitude, a break from the relentless pace of his high-powered life. But things had gone horribly wrong. A sudden storm had caught him off guard, causing him to slip and fall near a rocky stream. That was the last thing he remembered before waking up in Maya's care. Though his explanation seemed straightforward enough, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. There was an air of mystery about him, a tension in his demeanor that hinted at secrets he wasn't ready to reveal. For one thing, his clothes, though torn and dirty, were clearly expensive, tailored to perfection. The watch on his wrist gleamed even in the dim light of her hut, its design sleek and sophisticated. And then, there were the calls. Ethan carried a smartphone tucked inside his jacket pocket, miraculously unharmed despite his ordeal. Several times a day it would buzz insistently, lighting up with notifications and missed calls. At first Maya thought nothing of it, assuming they were concerned friends or colleagues wondering where he was. But as the days went on, Ethan grew increasingly agitated whenever the device rang. He rarely answered, and when he did, his conversations were cryptic, filled with hushed tones and vague reassurances. One evening, while tending to the fire outside her hut, Maya overheard him speaking urgently into the phone. She had been chopping vegetables nearby, pretending not to listen, but his words drifted toward her anyway. "I'm fine," he whispered sharply, glancing around as if afraid someone might be watching. "But I can't come back yet. Not until I figure out who I can trust." Maya froze, her knife hovering mid-air. Trust? What did he mean by that? Who couldn't he trust? Her mind raced with possibilities. Was he involved in some kind of trouble? Had he angered someone powerful? The questions swirled in her head, but she forced herself to stay calm. Confronting him directly wouldn't help. Not yet, at least. Instead, she resolved to keep a closer eye on him, paying attention to every detail, no matter how small. Despite her growing suspicions, Maya couldn't deny that Ethan was changing her world in unexpected ways. During his recovery, he began teaching her things she'd never imagined learning. He showed her how to use his smartphone, explaining concepts like apps, GPS, and internet searches. To Maya, whose knowledge of technology extended only as far as the old radio in her grandmother's room, these lessons felt like glimpses into another universe. She marveled at the idea of being able to access information instantly, of connecting with people across vast distances with just a tap of a finger. In return, Maya introduced Ethan to her world. She took him on short walks through the forest, pointing out edible plants and medicinal herbs. She taught him how to identify animal tracks and navigate using the position of the sun. Though he struggled at first, his polished shoes ill-suited for rough terrain, he proved to be a quick learner, soaking up her knowledge with genuine curiosity. Their interactions became a sort of exchange, each sharing pieces of their lives with the other. Yet, beneath the surface of this newfound camaraderie, unease lingered. One afternoon, as they sat together under the shade of a large oak tree, Maya decided to broach the subject of his mysterious behavior. "Ethan," she began hesitantly, "you've been very kind to teach me all these things, and I'm grateful. But is everything okay? You seem worried." Ethan hesitated, his expression guarded. For a moment, Maya thought he might brush her off, but then he sighed deeply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "It's complicated," he admitted. "Let's just say I made some enemies, powerful ones. They think I'm dead, and for now, that's safer. For both of us." His words sent a chill down Maya's spine. Enemies? Dead? What had she gotten herself into? Panic bubbled up inside her, but she forced herself to remain composed. "What kind of enemies?" she asked cautiously. Ethan shook his head. "I can't tell you more right now. Please understand, it's better if you don't know, but I promise I'll leave as soon as I'm strong enough. I don't want to put you in danger." Though his answer raised more questions than it answered, Maya nodded. Deep down, she knew he was holding back, but pushing him further wouldn't help. Besides, despite his secrets, she couldn't ignore the fact that he had become a part of her routine, a strange, unsettling part perhaps, but a part nonetheless. And strangely, she found herself wanting to believe him, to trust that he meant her no harm. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in hues of gold and crimson, Maya realized something important. Whether she liked it or not, her life had changed forever. The quiet simplicity she had once known was slipping away, replaced by uncertainty and intrigue. Whatever lay ahead, she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't turn back now. The days that followed Ethan's cryptic confession were filled with tension and unease. Maya tried to go about her daily routine as if nothing had changed, but it was impossible to ignore the shadow of danger looming over their lives. Every rustle of leaves in the wind, every distant footstep near the edge of the village sent a jolt of fear through her heart. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Ethan, too, seemed on edge. He barely left the hut now, spending most of his time pacing back and forth or staring out the small window, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. His phone buzzed incessantly, lighting up with messages and calls from people he refused to speak to. Occasionally, he would glance at the screen, mutter something under his breath, and then silence it again. It was clear that whatever enemies he spoke of weren't giving up easily. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Maya returned home after gathering firewood. She found Ethan sitting, cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by papers he had printed using an old printer he claimed to have borrowed from a nearby town. The documents were covered in numbers, charts, and unfamiliar terms that made no sense to Maya. Still, the intensity in his eyes told her they were important, perhaps even dangerous. "What are those?" she asked cautiously, setting down her basket. Ethan looked up, startled, as if he hadn't heard her approach. When he saw it was Maya, his shoulders relaxed slightly, though the tension in his expression remained. "Evidence," he said simply, tapping one of the pages with his finger. "Proof of what they've done." "Who?" Maya pressed, lowering herself onto the mat beside him. "And what exactly did they do?" Ethan hesitated, clearly weighing whether or not to trust her completely. Finally, he sighed and leaned back against the wall. "You deserve to know," he said quietly. "But I need you to understand that this goes far beyond just me. If anyone finds out I'm alive, and that I have this, it won't just be my life at risk, yours will be too." Maya swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. Despite her fear, curiosity burned inside her. She nodded slowly. "Tell me." Ethan took a deep breath before launching into his story. He explained that he was once the CEO of a major tech company, a position that came with wealth, power, and influence. But beneath the polished exterior of success lay a web of corruption so tangled that even he hadn't realized its full extent, until recently. A group of high-ranking executives within the company had been siphoning off millions of dollars, funneling the money into offshore accounts while covering their tracks with fake invoices and falsified reports. When Ethan stumbled upon the scheme during a routine audit, he confronted them, demanding answers. Instead of coming clean, they turned on him. They accused him of embezzling the funds himself, planting false evidence to frame him. Before he could defend himself, rumors began circulating that he had fled the country to avoid arrest. Knowing he couldn't fight back without proof, Ethan staged his own disappearance, taking with him the only copies of the incriminating documents. Now he was hiding, not just from the police, but from hired mercenaries tasked with silencing him permanently. "And these men, they're looking for you?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Ethan replied grimly, "which is why I need to stay hidden, at least until I can figure out how to expose them." Maya sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything he had told her. It sounded like something out of a movie, a tale of corporate espionage and betrayal played out on a grand scale. But this wasn't fiction, it was real, and somehow she had become entangled in it. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Over the next few days, strange things began happening around the village. Men in dark suits appeared in the market, asking questions about a lost hiker. They claimed to be search and rescue volunteers, but their polished shoes and city accents gave them away. Villagers whispered among themselves, speculating about who the mysterious stranger might be. Some thought it was a tourist who had wandered off course. Others believed it was a criminal on the run. No one suspected the truth, not yet anyway. Maya knew better than to draw attention to herself, but paranoia gnawed at her constantly. She avoided the market altogether, relying on neighbors to bring her supplies instead. At night, she kept a knife close by her side, jumping at every creak and groan of the old wooden hut. Ethan, meanwhile, grew increasingly restless, pacing like a caged animal. He insisted they needed to leave soon before the mercenaries closed in. "But where will we go?" Maya asked one evening, frustration creeping into her voice. "We can't just disappear into thin air." "We don't have to," Ethan replied. "I know a place, a remote cabin deep in the mountains. It's owned by a friend who owes me a favor. We can hide there until I figure out my next move." Maya frowned. "And what about me? What happens when they find out I helped you?" "They won't," Ethan said firmly. "Not if we're careful. Once we get to the cabin, I'll send the evidence to a journalist I trust, someone who can blow this whole thing wide open. After that, it won't matter anymore. They'll be too busy dealing with the fallout to come after us. Though his plan sounded logical, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that it was reckless. What if something went wrong? What if the mercenaries caught up to them before they reached the cabin? The risks were enormous, and yet she couldn't bring herself to walk away. Whether it was loyalty, compassion, or sheer stubbornness, she felt bound to see this through, to help Ethan finish what he had started. The morning they decided to leave, Maya packed lightly, stuffing a few essentials into her worn leather bag. Ethan carried the documents in a waterproof pouch tucked securely inside his jacket. Together, they slipped out of the village before dawn, moving quickly and quietly through the forest. Maya led the way, her knowledge of the terrain guiding them along hidden paths and overgrown trails. Behind her, Ethan struggled to keep up, his injured arm slowing him down. As they trekked deeper into the wilderness, the air grew colder, and the trees loomed taller, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the pale gray sky. The world felt eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Every step brought them closer to safety, but also closer to danger. Maya glanced over her shoulder frequently, half expecting to see shadows moving among the trees. So far they were alone, but she knew it wouldn't last forever. By midday, they reached a narrow ravine spanned by a rickety wooden bridge. The structure groaned ominously under their weight as they crossed, each plank creaking and swaying precariously over the rushing stream below. Just as they reached the other side, a sharp crack echoed through the air, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Ethan stumbled forward, nearly losing his footing, but Maya grabbed his arm and pulled him to safety. Breathing heavily, they turned back to see the bridge collapse into the churning water. For a moment, relief washed over them. They had made it across. But then, a chilling realization struck. Someone had sabotaged the bridge. This wasn't an accident. They weren't alone. "Run," Ethan shouted, grabbing Maya's hand. Without hesitation, they sprinted into the forest, dodging roots and leaping over rocks as adrenaline surged through their veins. Behind them, faint voices called out, growing louder with each passing second. The mercenaries had found them. The forest became a blur of motion as Maya and Ethan ran for their lives. Their footsteps pounded against the uneven ground, leaves crunching beneath their shoes, branches whipping at their faces. Every breath felt like fire in their lungs, but they pushed forward, driven by sheer desperation. Behind them, the voices grew louder, shouts of anger and determination cutting through the stillness of the woods. "They're gaining on us," Ethan gasped, clutching his injured arm as he stumbled over a root. Maya reached out instinctively to steady him, her fingers gripping his wrist tightly. "Keep going," she urged, her voice sharp with urgency. "We can't stop now." Maya's mind raced as she led the way, her knowledge of the terrain guiding them through narrow paths and dense thickets that only someone who had spent years navigating these woods would know. She ducked under low-hanging branches and leapt over fallen logs, all while keeping one hand firmly on Ethan's arm to ensure he didn't fall behind. His injury slowed them down, but Maya refused to let go. Not now, not when every second counted. They pushed deeper into the wilderness. The sounds of pursuit began to fade slightly. The mercenaries, unfamiliar with the forest, were struggling to keep up. Maya allowed herself a brief moment of hope. If they could just reach the mountain pass ahead, a steep, rocky trail too treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with it, they might have a chance to lose their pursuers entirely. But fate had other plans. Suddenly, Ethan tripped over an exposed tree root and crashed to the ground with a pained grunt. Maya spun around immediately, dropping to her knees beside him. "Are you okay?" she whispered urgently, scanning his face for signs of serious injury. "I'm fine," he muttered through gritted teeth, though sweat beaded on his forehead, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. "Just help me up." Maya pulled him to his feet, supporting his weight as they pressed on. But the delay had cost them precious time. The voices behind them grew louder again, closer this time. They were running out of options. Desperation sparked in Maya's chest. Thinking quickly, She spotted a cluster of large boulders nearby, partially hidden by thick vines. Without hesitation, she tugged Ethan toward them, dragging him into the narrow space between two rocks. It was tight, cramped, and far from ideal, but it offered some cover. Pressing a finger to her lips to signal silence, she crouched low, pulling Ethan down beside her. Moments later, the mercenaries burst into view. There were 3 of them, their faces hard and unyielding, their movements calculated as they scanned the area. One of them carried a rifle slung over his shoulder, its metallic gleam catching the dim light filtering through the trees. Another held a machete, slicing through thick foliage as they moved. The third man barked orders, his voice harsh and commanding. "They couldn't have gone far," he growled. "Spread out. Find them." Maya's heart hammered in her chest as she watched them from her hiding spot. Her body trembled, not from fear alone, but from the effort of remaining absolutely still. Beside her, Ethan clenched his fists, his jaw tight with tension. Neither dared to breathe too loudly. For what felt like an eternity, the mercenaries searched the area, their boots crunching leaves and snapping twigs as they moved. Maya prayed silently that the dense vines and shadows would conceal them, that the mercenaries wouldn't think to look so close to where they stood. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the men regrouped, frustration evident in their expressions. "They must have doubled back," one of them muttered. "Or crossed the ravine before the bridge collapsed," another suggested. With a final glance around, the leader signaled for them to move on. Slowly, cautiously, they disappeared into the forest, their voices fading into the distance. Only when the sound of their footsteps was completely gone did Maya allow herself to exhale. She turned to Ethan, her eyes wide with relief. "We made it," she whispered hoarsely. "For now." Ethan nodded, though his expression remained grim. "We can't stay here. They'll double back sooner or later. We need to keep moving." Though exhaustion weighed heavily on both of them, they forced themselves to stand and continue their journey. This time, Maya led them along an even more obscure route, a winding path that twisted through jagged cliffs and dense underbrush. It was slow going, especially for Ethan, whose strength was visibly waning. Yet, despite the physical toll, something shifted between them during those quiet, tense hours. As they trudged onward, Ethan began opening up in ways he hadn't before. He spoke softly, almost absent-mindedly, about his life before the chaos, the pressure of running a multi-billion-dollar company, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who cared more about his wealth than who he truly was. He admitted that he had always envied people like Maya, those who lived simple, honest lives free from the constant scrutiny and greed of the corporate world. "I never thought I'd say this," he confessed, pausing to catch his breath. "But I think I prefer your world to mine." Maya glanced at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "It's not perfect," she replied gently. "There's hunger, sickness, and hardship. But I guess there's also freedom. Freedom to choose how you live, without worrying about losing everything because of someone else's greed." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For the first time, Ethan looked at her, not as a stranger who had saved his life, but as someone who understood him in a way few others ever had. In that moment, amidst the danger and uncertainty, a bond began to form between them. It wasn't romantic, not yet anyway. Rather, it was a shared understanding born of adversity, a mutual respect forged in the crucible of survival. By nightfall, they reached a small clearing nestled high in the mountains. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the wind carried, a biting chill. Maya built a small fire using dry twigs and bark, careful to keep it contained so as not to attract attention. They huddled close to the flames, sharing a meager meal of dried fruits and nuts Maya had packed. As the fire crackled softly, Ethan pulled out the waterproof pouch containing the incriminating documents. He stared at it for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "This is it," he said finally, his voice tinged with resolve. "Everything depends on getting this to the right person." "And then what?" Maya asked quietly. "What happens after that?" Ethan hesitated, glancing at her. "I don't know," he admitted. "My old life is gone. Even if I clear my name, I can't go back to the way things were. Too much has changed." Maya nodded slowly, sensing the weight of his words. She wanted to ask what that meant for her, for them, but she held back. Now wasn't the time for such questions. Instead, she focused on the task at hand. Surviving, long enough to see justice served. The next morning, they set off again, climbing higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner and the path became steeper, testing their endurance to the limit. At one point, Ethan nearly slipped on a patch of loose gravel, but Maya caught him just in time, her reflexes saving him from a potentially fatal fall. Gratitude flashed in his eyes as he steadied himself, and for the first time Maya saw something new in his gaze. Admiration. "You're stronger than you look," he remarked with a faint smile. "So are you," she shot back, grinning despite herself, for a city boy anyway. Their banter provided a momentary reprieve from the tension, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humor could be a lifeline. Still, neither forgot the gravity of their situation. With each step, they drew closer to the cabin Ethan had mentioned, a place where they could regroup, plan their next move, and hopefully bring an end to the nightmare chasing them. But as they neared their destination, a nagging thought lingered in Maya's mind. What would happen once they reached the cabin? Would Ethan leave her behind, disappearing into the world he came from? Or would their bond prove strong enough to transcend the vast differences between their lives? Only time would tell. The cabin finally came into view late in the afternoon, nestled at the edge of a cliff overlooking a sprawling valley below. It was small and weathered, its wooden walls gray with age and streaked with moss. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, evidence that Ethan's friend had followed through on his promise to prepare the place for them. Relief washed over Maya as she took in the sight. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, warmth, and safety, at least for now. Ethan pushed open the creaky door, stepping inside cautiously. The interior was simple yet functional. A small kitchen area, a table with mismatched chairs, a cot in one corner, and a stack of firewood by the hearth. A note sat on the table, scrawled in hurried handwriting. "Stay safe. Trust no one. I'll check back when I can." Ethan crumpled the paper in his fist, his jaw tightening. Even here, even after all they'd been through, there was no room for trust. Maya busied herself lighting a fire while Ethan paced the room, clutching the waterproof pouch containing the incriminating documents. His eyes darted toward the windows, constantly, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Though they were miles away from the mercenaries, paranoia lingered like a shadow. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. Not yet. As the flames crackled to life, casting flickering light across the room, Ethan turned to Maya. "We need to send this information out," he said, holding up the pouch. "Tonight." Maya nodded, though unease coiled in her stomach. "Do you think it's safe? What if they're tracking your phone?" "I've thought about that," Ethan replied, pulling a laptop from his backpack. "I brought this with me, a secure device, disconnected from my usual network. Once I upload the files to the journalist server, they'll be impossible to trace back to us." "But what happens then?" Maya asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Once the story goes public, won't they come looking for you again?" "They will," Ethan admitted grimly. "But once the truth is out, it won't matter anymore. The people behind this, they'll have bigger problems than hunting me down. And besides..." He hesitated, glancing at her. "By then we'll already be gone." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Maya stared at him, her heart pounding. Gone where? Did he mean both of them, or just himself? She wanted to ask, to demand answers, but the look in his eyes stopped her. There was pain there, conflict, something he wasn't ready to share. For the next hour, Ethan worked silently at the table, typing furiously on the laptop. Maya watched him intently, torn between admiration and fear. This man, this stranger who had stumbled into her life, was risking everything to expose the truth. Yet, despite his determination, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something he wasn't telling her. Finally, Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "It's done," he said, closing the laptop. "The files are uploaded. By tomorrow morning, the whole world will know." A wave of relief swept over. Maya followed quickly by dread. Now that the evidence was out, there was no turning back. Whatever happened next would change everything, for better or worse. Later that night, as the wind howled outside and the fire burned low, Maya lay awake on the floor, staring at the ceiling. Sleep eluded her, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. Beside her, Ethan tossed and turned on the cot, clearly restless. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them felt heavier than ever. Eventually, unable to bear it any longer, Maya sat up and turned to him. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the storm. "Can I ask you something?" He rolled onto his side, meeting her gaze in the dim light. "Of course." "What happens to us after this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You keep saying we, but do you even want me around once this is over? Or am I just someone who helped you along the way?" Ethan froze, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he didn't respond, and Maya braced herself for rejection. Then, slowly, he sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Maya," he began softly, "you've done more for me than anyone else ever has. You saved my life, not just physically, but emotionally too. Before I met you, I was lost. My world was crumbling and I didn't know how to fix it. But being with you, it reminded me of what really matters." Tears pricked at the corners of Maya's eyes as she listened, unsure whether to believe him. "Then why do I feel like you're planning to leave me behind?" she asked, her voice cracking. Ethan sighed, guilt flashing in his eyes. "Because I almost did," he admitted. "When I first told you about the documents, I thought maybe it would be easier if I disappeared again, if I protected you by staying out of your life. And now?" Maya pressed, her heart hammering in her chest. "Now," Ethan said, his voice firm, "I realize I was wrong. You've become a part of this journey, Maya. Of my journey, and I don't want to lose that. Not unless you decide you don't want it anymore." Relief flooded through Maya, but it was short-lived. As much as she cared for Ethan, doubt still lingered. Could she truly fit into his world? Would he be able to adjust to hers? These questions swirled in her mind, unanswered, but impossible to ignore. The next morning brought chaos. News of the scandal broke early, splashed across headlines, worldwide. Reporters clamored for details, speculating about the downfall of one of the largest tech companies in history. Meanwhile, authorities launched investigations, arresting key executives and freezing assets linked to the embezzlement scheme. Ethan's name was cleared almost instantly, vindicated by the mountain of evidence he had provided. But the victory was bittersweet. As the news spread, so did the danger. The mercenaries, desperate to silence Ethan permanently, redoubled their efforts to find him. Calls poured in from every corner, from journalists seeking interviews to former colleagues offering apologies, but Ethan ignored them all. Instead, he focused on keeping Maya safe. "We need to move," he told her urgently, packing their belongings into a pair of duffel bags. "They'll figure out where we are sooner or later." "Where will we go?" Maya asked, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "Somewhere remote," Ethan replied. "Somewhere they'll never think to look." As they prepared to leave, Maya noticed Ethan slipping something into his pocket, a flash drive. Curiosity got the better of her. "What's that?" she asked. "A backup," he explained. "In case something happens to me. Everything we need to take them down is on here. If I don't make it—" Maya cut him off, grabbing his arm. "Don't say that," she snapped, her voice fierce. "You're not leaving me, not now, not ever. We're in this together, remember?" Ethan stared at her, surprise giving way to gratitude. "Okay," he said softly. "Together." With that, they stepped out into the cold morning air, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them. Ahead lay an unknown future, fraught with challenges neither could predict. But as they walked side by side, their footsteps synchronized. One thing became clear: whatever came next, they would face it together. The journey that followed was nothing short of harrowing. Ethan and Maya moved like ghosts, slipping from one remote location to another, always staying one step ahead of their pursuers. They traveled by night, avoiding main roads and sticking to hidden trails only locals would know. Maya's intimate knowledge of the wilderness became their greatest asset, guiding them through dense forests, across icy streams, and over jagged cliffs that seemed impassable to anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. Despite the constant danger, there were moments of quiet connection between them: stolen glances around a flickering campfire, whispered conversations under starlit skies, shared laughter at the absurdity of their situation. These fleeting glimpses of normalcy reminded Maya of why she had stayed with Ethan, even when every instinct screamed at her to run in the opposite direction. He wasn't just the wealthy businessman she had first encountered in the forest. He was someone who had opened his heart to her, flaws and all, and though their worlds couldn't have been more different, they found common ground in their shared struggle for survival. But the mercenaries weren't giving up. Every time Maya and Ethan thought they had shaken them off, fresh signs of pursuit would emerge: a broken branch here, a discarded cigarette butt there. It was clear their enemies were relentless, willing to go to any lengths to silence Ethan permanently. The tension grew unbearable, pressing down on them like a storm cloud refusing to break. One evening, as they huddled inside an abandoned shed deep in the mountains, Ethan finally broke the silence. "We can't keep running forever," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Sooner or later they'll catch up to us." Maya looked at him sharply. "What are you saying? That we should give up?" "No," Ethan replied quickly, shaking his head. "I'm saying we need a plan. A way to end this once and for all." He pulled out the flash drive from his pocket, turning it over in his hands thoughtfully. "This is our ace card," he continued. "If we can get this into the right hands, someone powerful enough to protect us, it might be enough to stop them." "But how?" Maya asked, her brow furrowed. "Who could possibly help us against people like that?" Ethan hesitated, then met her gaze steadily. "There's someone I trust. An old mentor of mine. He has connections, resources, and most importantly, he owes me a favor. If we can reach him, he can make sure the truth gets out safely while keeping us protected." It was a risky gamble, but Maya knew they didn't have many options left. "Where is he?" she asked. "In the city," Ethan admitted reluctantly. "It's dangerous, but it's our best shot." Reaching the city proved to be the hardest part of their journey. The open countryside gave way to crowded streets and towering buildings, each corner teeming with potential threats. Maya felt completely out of place in her worn clothes, drawing curious stares from passers-by dressed in sharp suits and designer outfits. Ethan, too, looked uncomfortable despite his polished demeanor, his injuries still healing and his face gaunt from weeks on the run. They navigated the urban maze cautiously, sticking to back alleys and blending into shadows whenever possible. Finally, after hours of careful maneuvering, they arrived at a nondescript office building tucked away in a quieter part of town. Ethan knocked on the door 3 times, waited, then twice more. A prearranged signal. The door creaked open to reveal a tall, gray-haired man with piercing blue eyes. He studied them for a moment before stepping aside to let them in. "Ethan," he said gruffly, closing the door behind them. "You look like hell." "Nice to see you too, Daniel," Ethan replied dryly, managing a weak smile. Daniel turned his attention to Maya, raising an eyebrow. "And who's this?" "This is Maya," Ethan said, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "She saved my life, and kept me alive long enough to expose the truth. We wouldn't be here without her." Daniel nodded slowly, his expression softening slightly. "Well, you got guts, kid, both of you do." He gestured for them to sit, then poured 3 cups of coffee from a battered pot on his desk. "Now tell me everything." For the next hour, Ethan laid out their story, the conspiracy, the evidence, the mercenaries hunting them. Daniel listened intently, his face unreadable until Ethan handed over the flash drive. Then for the first time he smiled, a grim, satisfied curve of his lips. "This will do nicely," he said, slipping the drive into a secure briefcase. "Leave the rest to me." True to his word, Daniel acted swiftly. Within days, the scandal exploded onto the global stage, overshadowing even the initial revelations. High-profile arrests were made, corporate empires crumbled, and public outrage reached fever pitch. The mercenaries, realizing their employers were finished, vanished into the shadows, no longer interested in pursuing Ethan. With the immediate threat neutralized, Daniel arranged safe passage for Maya and Ethan to a secluded estate far from prying eyes. It was a beautiful place surrounded by rolling hills and lush gardens, offering a stark contrast to the chaos they had endured. For the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves to relax, to breathe deeply without fear of what lay around the next corner. Yet, as peaceful as their new surroundings were, Maya couldn't ignore the lingering question hanging between them. What came next? One afternoon, as they strolled along a winding path lined with blooming flowers, Ethan finally addressed it. "Maya," he began hesitantly, stopping to face her. "I owe you everything. Not just for saving my life, but for reminding me of who I am. You've changed me in ways I never thought possible." Maya smiled faintly, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. "So what does that mean for us?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It means I want you to come with me, to start a new life together. But I also know you have roots here, responsibilities, your grandmother, your village. I wouldn't ask you to leave that behind unless you truly wanted to." Tears welled up in Maya's eyes as she processed his words. She cared deeply for Ethan, but the idea of leaving her home, the only world she had ever known, felt overwhelming. Still, she realized something important. She had already begun to change, just as Ethan had. Her time with him had opened her eyes to possibilities she had never dared to dream of. "I'll need time to think," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "But whatever I choose, I want you to know, I don't regret meeting you. You've shown me a side of myself I didn't know existed." Ethan nodded, understanding written all over his face. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." Weeks passed and Maya made her decision. With a heavy heart, she chose to return to her village, not because she didn't love Ethan, but because she needed to find her own path. She promised to stay in touch, and Ethan vowed to visit whenever he could. As they stood on a hill overlooking the forest where their journey had begun, Maya watched him drive away, the sleek car disappearing into the horizon. Though their lives would take different directions, Maya knew one thing for certain. The bond they had formed would endure, shaping both of them in ways neither could have imagined. And as she turned back toward her village, ready to embrace whatever the future held, she carried with her the memory of a man who had taught her the true meaning of courage and the power of second chances.